The clock read 11:47 p.m. when Officer Raymond Doyle eased his squad car down the quiet suburban streets of Greenfield, a small American town whose biggest concerns usually involved petty theft or fender benders. But Doyle, who prided himself on gut feelings, always found reasons to stop certain drivers. This evening, his gaze locked onto a sleek, black sedan driving a few miles under the speed limit. The driver, a well-dressed black man, immediately triggered Doyle's suspicion. With a flick of the switch, red and blue lights illuminated the empty street. As Doyle approached, he shined his flashlight into the window. Behind the wheel sat Detective Marcus Green, though Doyle didn't yet know his name or title. Marcus offered a polite smile, producing his license and registration without protest. His tailored navy suit contrasted with the drab interior of the car. He exuded calm authority. "License and registration," Doyle demanded, voice tight. He didn't bother with small talk. Marcus handed them over, quietly observing Doyle's demeanor. There was a tension in the air that suggested this was no ordinary stop. "Is there a problem, officer?" Marcus asked, his tone politely neutral. "You were driving suspiciously slow," Doyle grumbled. "Where are you coming from?" Marcus offered a disarming shrug. "From the state police headquarters. I had a late meeting." That response made Doyle falter. State police. He carefully examined the driver's license. As he read the words, "Internal Affairs," next to Marcus's official ID, Doyle's stomach twisted. He glanced at the man's face again, noticing the unwavering calm in those dark eyes. Marcus Green, head of Internal Affairs. For a moment, Doyle's pulse pounded. He'd heard rumors about a new IA head who was determined to crack down on misconduct. And here he was, face to face with him, having initiated an unnecessary stop. His mind raced. If Green believed this was racially motivated, Doyle could face suspension, or worse. Trying to keep his composure, he offered a forced smile. "Everything checks out," he managed, handing back the documents. "You're free to go." Marcus accepted his paperwork, offering a cool nod. There was no anger in his eyes, but there was clarity. He knew exactly what kind of officer Doyle was. "Have a good night," he said calmly, rolling his window up. Doyle watched the sedan merge back onto the road and vanish into the darkness. Beneath the streetlight's harsh glow, his thoughts churned. Who would believe he stopped the head of Internal Affairs for anything other than bias? Had he just handed Green the perfect reason to open an investigation into his entire career? The rest of the night, Doyle continued his patrol, but his thoughts never left that brief encounter. He couldn't shake the sensation that he'd just lit the fuse on a powder keg, and when it blew, it might take his badge, his reputation, and possibly more along with it. The next morning, the Greenfield Police Department hummed with hushed gossip. Doyle arrived early, hoping to slip in without attracting attention, but even the front desk officer gave him a knowing look. Word traveled fast. He headed to his cubicle, which he shared with his partner, Officer Carla Evans. Carla was a sharp-eyed woman in her late 20s, known for her professionalism and empathy. She sipped coffee, eyebrows arching as Doyle approached. "Ray, is it true?" she asked quietly. "You pulled over Internal Affairs last night." Doyle sank into his chair, exhaling a frustrated breath. "I didn't know who he was," he muttered. "He was going too slow. It looked suspicious." Carla's face was a mix of concern and mild disbelief. "Suspiciously slow, or did you just see a black guy in a nice car and decide he was up to something?" Doyle tensed. "That's not fair," he said defensively. "Maybe not," Carla conceded, "but you know that's how it's going to look." From across the room, Sergeant Wilkins stepped out of his office. He was an older man, nearing retirement, who often turned a blind eye to departmental politics. Today, however, he walked straight to Doyle's desk, arms folded. "Doyle," he said. "Chief wants to see you." Doyle felt every eye in the station settle on him as he stood, his heartbeat uncomfortably loud in his ears. In the chief's office, a cramped room dominated by a large wooden desk, Chief Harriet Collins motioned for Doyle to sit. She wasted no time getting to the point. "I got a call this morning from Detective Marcus Green, the new IA head," she said, pinning him with a hard stare. "He wants your file. Wants to know your complaint history, disciplinary actions, everything." Doyle swallowed. His disciplinary record wasn't pristine. He'd had a few complaints for aggressive stops and questionable remarks, mostly from minorities, but none had stuck, until now. "What do I do?" Doyle asked quietly, hating how small his voice sounded. Chief Collins leaned forward. "Cooperate. And watch your step," she said firmly. "He's not just any internal investigator, he's known for being thorough. If you've given him reason to think you're a liability, he'll tear your record apart." By midday, the rumor mill had gone into overdrive. Carla attempted to console Doyle, but he pushed her away with curt answers. Fear and anger warred inside him. He knew racism in policing was a contentious topic that could end careers. He also knew that if Green wanted to make an example of him, the smallest slip could be fatal to his job. Outside, a crisp autumn wind blew across the department's parking lot as Doyle emerged for a break. He spotted Green stepping out of a black SUV, apparently here to meet with the chief. The detective's gaze flicked in Doyle's direction, momentarily locking eyes. That brief contact sent a shiver down Doyle's spine, as if the writing on the wall was spelled out in that single glance: "I've got your number." As the day wore on, Doyle found it harder to focus on routine tasks. Every ring of the phone, every passing conversation, seemed to hint at his downfall. He'd built his life around being a cop, forging an identity as the tough enforcer. If he lost his badge, what would he be? In that moment, doom felt inevitable. And Doyle had no idea how far this would escalate, or the tragedy that would soon unfold, casting a dark shadow over them all. Detective Marcus Green settled into a cramped, temporary office on the second floor of the Greenfield Municipal Building. Stacks of folders, a half-organized laptop, and a single overhead light gave the space a makeshift feel. But for the new head of internal affairs, all he needed was a desk and a door that closed. He opened Doyle's file. Several complaints dotted the record like landmines: excessive force allegations, racially biased comments, cases closed due to insufficient evidence. Green frowned. It was a pattern he'd seen too often. The system had a habit of protecting its own. But this time, he was determined to see it through. A knock on the door broke his concentration. The building security guard poked his head in. "Detective, there's a Carla Evans here to see you." "Send her in," Green replied. Carla stepped into the dimly lit room, her face etched with concern. "Detective Green, she paused, as though choosing her words with care. "I want to talk to you about Officer Doyle." Green motioned for her to sit. "I'm listening." She explained how she'd partnered with Doyle for the past year, gradually noticing his skewed approach to traffic stops and suspect questioning. "He's not always like that," she said softly, as if trying to convince herself. "Sometimes he's a decent cop, but there's a line he crosses when he thinks nobody's looking." Green studied her intently. "Are you filing a formal complaint?" Carla's eyes flickered. "I don't know yet. I just thought you should have the truth, from someone who's worked beside him." Green thanked her for her candor. After she left, he jotted down notes, feeling both gratified and uneasy. This was more than enough reason to delve deeper into Doyle's history. If Carla Evans was brave enough to speak up, how many others simply hadn't dared? That night, Alone in the office, Green pored over digital records. Hours slipped by, illuminated only by the laptop's glow. Eventually, he noticed something unusual. Several older complaints against Doyle were missing. A quick system cross-check showed they had existed 6 months prior, but now they'd seemingly vanished from the official database. A chill snaked through his thoughts. Someone was tampering with evidence. Was Doyle covering his tracks, or was there a bigger conspiracy within the department? The door rattled unexpectedly, startling Green. He glanced up. Silence. Rising, he opened the door to the corridor, only to find it empty. The overhead lights flickered ominously, revealing not a soul in sight. Tension coiled in his gut. This was the second strange occurrence since he'd taken the Doyle case. First, suspicious phone calls with no one on the line. Now, missing records and footsteps in the night. Green locked up and headed home, more resolved than ever to expose the truth. Meanwhile, across town in a dimly lit bar, Doyle sat hunched over a whiskey glass. Another officer had texted him, Green's digging deeper. Watch yourself. Doyle gripped his phone, knuckles white. He could feel the walls closing in. Everyone seemed to be turning on him, Carla, the department, even old case files he'd thought buried. Fear morphed into a quiet rage. In a desperate whisper, he muttered, I'll do what I have to. The night stretched on, the seeds of violence and tragedy planted. Neither man could see just how deadly this would all become. The tension at the precinct was like a tightrope stretched to its limits. Doyle entered the station the following day with eyes straight ahead, ignoring the hush that fell among his colleagues. His face was pale, his movements stiff. He'd hardly slept, haunted by nightmares of losing everything. Shortly after he arrived, Sergeant Wilkins cornered him. Chief wants another word, Wilkins said, a concerned edge to his voice. Doyle trudged to the chief's office, heart pounding. Chief Collins, arms crossed, delivered the bad news. Doyle, you're being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Hand over your badge and gun. Doyle's eyes blazed. You can't do this, Collins remained firm. I have no choice. Green found inconsistencies in your old cases. If you've done nothing wrong, you'll be reinstated. Until then, you're off duty. Shaking with fury, Doyle slammed the door on his way out, ignoring the startled glances of fellow officers. Carla tried to speak to him, but he brushed past her. He felt betrayed, cornered, and desperate. That evening, with the sun dipping low over Greenfield, Detective Green locked up his temporary office and headed to his car. As he reached his driver's door, a voice made him freeze. Green. He turned to see Doyle, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, a wild look in his eyes. The former officer approached, stopping a few feet away. You've ruined my life, Doyle hissed. All because I pulled you over. Green's heart thumped, but he kept calm. I just followed the evidence, he replied. And I gave you every chance to explain. Doyle's lip curled. Spare me the lecture, he snapped. You want me gone. For a moment, Green wondered if Doyle might draw a weapon. But Doyle simply glared, then turned on his heel and stalked away, leaving Green with a sense of foreboding. The next day, Carla found Green at a local diner, where he often grabbed coffee before heading to the station. She slid into the booth across from him. Doyle's off the rails, she said in a hushed tone. I'm worried he's going to do something irreversible. Green sipped his coffee, expression grim. I don't want it to end badly, he said. But he has to face the consequences of his actions. That afternoon, Chief Collins announced that Internal Affairs would be concluding their investigation within days. Tension soared like a ticking time bomb. Officers whispered about how Doyle might lash out. Some, who quietly shared Doyle's biases, resented Green's presence, fueling an undercurrent of hostility. A rumor floated that Doyle had been spotted near the old Riverside Warehouse, a decrepit building on the edge of town where local kids told ghost stories. Green frowned when he heard the rumor. Why would Doyle go there? As evening fell, a cryptic text arrived on Green's phone. If you want the truth, come alone to Riverside Warehouse tonight. 8 p.m. No name, but the threat felt obvious. Could it be Doyle setting a trap? Or someone else with something to hide? Green deliberated. If it were a genuine tip, it could be key to cracking open the case. If it were a trap, he'd have to be cautious. Either way, the final confrontation was coming, and there was no turning back. Night enveloped the Riverside Warehouse in darkness. The structure was a relic of the past, its rusted metal walls and broken windows whispered stories of abandonment. Detective Marcus Green parked his unmarked car a short distance away, stepping out into the chilly evening air. He approached cautiously, flashlight in hand. The wind whistled through gaps in the corrugated siding, producing an eerie howling. Pausing at the entrance, he surveyed the interior. A few overhead lights flickered, revealing a dusty floor scattered with trash and debris. Near the center of the open space, a figure stood with shoulders squared. Officer Carla Evans emerged from the shadows. "Marcus," she called softly. Relief momentarily crossed Green's face, until another shape slid out from behind a stacked crate, Raymond Doyle. His face was etched with desperation, eyes wild. Even from a distance, Green could see Doyle's trembling hand clutched around a pistol. Carla raised her hands. "Doyle. I told you I'd try to talk to him, but this," Doyle's voice cracked. "You dragged him here." She shook her head. "I messaged him to meet me, but you insisted you had something to say. What are you doing with a gun?" Green kept his flashlight trained on the floor, one hand near his holster. "Doyle, we can talk this through. Put the gun down." Doyle glared, sweat beading on his brow. "Talk. You want me fired. You want me disgraced. Maybe even in prison." Carla stepped closer, voice trembling. "It doesn't have to be like this." In that moment, a swirl of pent-up emotions erupted in Doyle's eyes: fear, anger, betrayal. He swung the pistol toward Green. The detective moved to draw his weapon, but Carla threw herself between them, shouting, "No!" A shot cracked through the warehouse, echoing off the metal walls. Carla crumpled to the ground. Horror seized both men. Doyle stared at his smoking gun, disbelief turning to panic. Green, adrenaline surging, rushed to Carla's side. Blood spread across her uniform, her eyes wide with shock. Green pressed his hand to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me," he urged, voice raw. Doyle's weapon clattered to the floor, his face ashen. I didn't mean to," he stammered, backing away. But the moment hung in stasis. Carla's breathing became shallow, her pulse weakening under Green's desperate grip. He yelled for Doyle to call for help, but Doyle was frozen, tears streaming down his cheeks. Minutes later, sirens pierced the night. Backup and ambulances arrived in a flurry of flashing lights. Paramedics took over, performing frantic CPR as they lifted Carla onto a stretcher. Green stepped aside, blood staining his hands. Doyle stood in stunned silence, then dropped to his knees, hands raised in surrender. Officers quickly cuffed him, reading him his rights. The entire station seemed to arrive at once, staring in a collective horror at the final outcome of a conflict that spiraled out of control. Days later, the dust began to settle. Officer Carla Evans did not survive her injuries. Doyle faced charges of manslaughter, though some believed it was second-degree murder. Detective Marcus Green filed his final report, shattered by the loss of an officer who tried to do the right thing. The tragedy rippled through the community, sparking renewed calls for accountability. Green, grim-faced, concluded his investigation, knowing that Doyle's guilt would be determined in court. Justice would be served, though it would never undo the heartbreaking reality that Carla Evans, a woman caught between loyalty and integrity, had lost her life in the crossfire. In the end, the old warehouse stood as a silent testament to how fear, prejudice, and desperation could intertwine with lethal consequences. Greenfield's residents would remember the night an officer's bullet ended a life, leaving behind a cautionary tale: when hatred and distrust become bullets, no one escapes unscathed.